Merkavah is a Hebrew word with many connotations. In its simplest form, it means chariot, a horse-drawn vehicle of war, vital to the success of military campaigns. However, Merkavah is also the descriptive term for the earliest layers of Jewish mysticism, dating from the days of the ancient Israelite prophets. It consists of meditative reflections and ruminations on the throne of God, described by the prophet Ezekiel as a kind of heavenly chariot. An entire literature of Merkavah mysticism, the forerunner of what we know today as Kabbalah, has been preserved in Jewish tradition, dating from early medieval times, though the contents of this literature are far older, and were certainly passed down by word of mouth long before being recorded in the written sources. The question at hand is, was Yeshua, the historical Jesus, a Jewish mystic, an ancient Kabbalist of sorts? As with so many other questions, it's debatable. For their part, the Merkavah mystics focus their attention on the startling vision that opens the book of Ezekiel, in which the exiled and shackled prophet sees a manifestation from the heavens of four winged creatures like burning coals of fire, their faces surrounding a heavenly chariot. Obviously, Ezekiel's vision itself is evidence that there was some mystical strain in the prophetic era long before the period of the Merkavah mystics. The idea of the students of the chariot was to recreate Ezekiel's experience and ascend in the same chariot to explore the heavens, or the chambers of which heaven was supposed to consist. The Hebrew word for chambers, as in the chambers of the divine palace, is hechalot, a term describing the kindred group of hechalot mystics who, in the words of Hechalot Rabbati, the teaching of the chambers, expounded on the journey through the heavenly precincts. Merkavah and Hechalot mystics probably experienced ecstatic visions of the celestial hierarchies and the throne of God. In Merkavah mystical literature, the ascent of the visionary's soul is described as a perilous journey through 7 spheres or heavenly dwellings manned by hostile angels. The visionary's goal was to behold the divine throne situated on its chariot. One of the most important of such texts is the Book of Enoch, which purports to have been written by the biblical patriarch Enoch in antediluvian, that is, pre-flood times. Of course, the real author is an anonymous mystic who simply ascribes his work to the early patriarch to lend it authority. The Book of Enoch is a composite text which recounts a trip through the heavenly spheres to the throne of glory. Throughout the Book of Enoch, there is a particular emphasis on a group of disobedient priests from the heavenly temple, the counterpart of the earthly structure which stood on Mount Zion. They're called the Watchers. These angelic beings, these Watchers, writes the author mystic, are the very ones described in the passage in the book of Genesis dealing with the fallen angels, the sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The result was a race of half-breeds, half-human, half-angel, described by the book of Genesis as Nephilim, fallen ones. This terrible crime, insists the author, accounts for the explosion of sin upon the earth, which culminated in the great flood of Noah. The whole earth became corrupt. And just as corruption reigned supreme in those days, so it has become corrupt once more. Such ideas helped explain the suffering and persecution of the times in which the mystics lived. The only answer is to find God in a new, intimate way. The mystics of this literature always describe entering or ascending into paradise, pardes in Hebrew, followed by an overwhelming spiritual experience. The Assumption of Isaiah, for example, depicts a total of 7 heavens as the prophet ascends in the company of a guardian angel. The heavens become increasingly glorious and sublime. While in the 6th heaven, Isaiah's angelic guide explains, "If you rejoice over this light, how much more will you rejoice in the 7th heaven when you see the light where the Lord is and his beloved." All of these mystical writings seem to embody a search for the formula that would allow practitioners to make the same journey the prophets had made, jumping off from Ezekiel's vision or from passages in the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. They paint a vivid and imaginative picture of God's heavenly domain. In one of these works, Shiur Komah, the measurement of the height, the author actually describes the Creator in anthropomorphic, human-like terms. A human-like creature of such gigantic dimensions as to occupy the whole cosmos. His neck is 130.8 million miles long. His fingers are each 150.3 million miles long. Merkavah mysticism was strongly influenced by Gnostic beliefs. Merkavah initiates, known as Tznu'im, were limited to a select few with specific moral qualities and were required to prepare themselves by fasting. A successful visionary journey depended in part on the use of certain magical formulas called seals that were used to placate the angelic gatekeeper of each heavenly dwelling. The use of an incorrect seal could result in severe injury or a fiery death. The mystics who engaged in such creative speculations are unknown to us, but their works are proverbially attributed to such prominent men as Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, sages of the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. And there is a tradition that they were, in fact, members of Akiva's inner circle. The Talmud warns that among 4 men who entered the mystical orchard, or pardes as it was called, 1 died, 1 went mad, 1 fell away and became apostate, and only Rabbi Akiva had a true visionary experience, emerging unscathed. The Mishnah, Tosefta, and both Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds all contain parallel passages in which it is explicitly stated that it is forbidden to expound the work of the chariot before more than 1 listener. Passages in which Rabbi Akiva always figures prominently. Clearly, what Akiva and his colleagues were acknowledging is that a secret known by more than 2 people is not a secret, and a master must be sure of a pupil before giving him such highly charged information. On another level, those who practiced Merkavah were sometimes called explorers of the supernatural world, which may have implied descent into the depths of self. Merkavah mysticism began to flourish in Palestine during the 1st century of the Common Era, and thanks to a single Dead Sea Scroll, we have a clear reference to the chariot throne of God from the period in which Yeshua lived. The Song of Sabbath Sacrifices is the text in which the mystical author wrote, "His camp, holy exaltations for his glorious thrones and the footstool of his feet, and all his majestic chariots and his holy inner sanctums. While they are soaring aloft, a murmur of angelic voices is heard, and the lifting of their wings is accompanied by a clamor of joyous song. It is the murmur of angels blessing the chariot-like throne above the firmament of the cherubim, while they themselves from below the place where the glory dwells go acclaiming in joyous song the splendor of that radiant expanse. Whenever the wheels of that chariot are in motion, angels of sanctification dart to and fro all around it, between its glorious wheels. Like fiery apparitions, they are most holy spirits, looking like streams of fire in the likeness of burnished metal or of lustrous ware, clothed in luminous garments, an array of wondrous colors, diffuse with brightness. Live angelic spirits, constantly coming and going beside the glorious, wonderful chariot. Amid all the noise of their progress, a murmured intonation of blessings is heard. And whenever they come round, they shout their holy hallelujahs. When the angels soar aloft, they soar in wondrous unison. And when they alight, they say standing. Then the sound of the paean is hushed, and the murmur of angelic benedictions pervades all the camps of these godly beings. From the midst of their contingent, they utter praise. As in holy worship, each of their ranks breaks forth into joyous song, one after another. Finally, with 7 words of his mystical holiness, the 7th archangel blesses in the name of his holiness all the saintly beings among those who have laid the foundations for true knowledge. Famed 19th century Jewish scholar Heinrich Graetz argued that there was an undercurrent of superstition that ran through Galilean society, providing a resonance between Jesus and the Essenes, the presumed writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who were known for their obsession with the names of God, angels, and magical practices. He also suggested that there was a common culture that drew Jesus to the Essenes and made the people of Galilee receptive to his Essene teachings. This culture of magic and miracles, such as we've already seen in the likes of Honi the circle maker and Hanina ben Dosa, would make it easier for Graetz to see the Essenes as proto-mystics. Graetz described Jesus as teaching his disciples Essene principles concerning chastity, suffering, humility, self-denial, as well as other ideals. Then there's the contemporary scholar Bruce Chilton, who in his book Rabbi Jesus presents Yeshua as a Merkava mystic who mastered the technique of envisioning God's chariot throne. He frequently enjoyed a visionary ascent to the 7th heaven in which he beheld the divine glory and participated in angelic praise of God through his practiced meditation on the text of Ezekiel chapter 1. For Chilton, this meditative practice explains the events at Yeshua's immersion, baptism, when a dove descends and a voice from heaven declares, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," as well as many of Yeshua's presumed miracles, including divine healing, the stilling of the storm, and Yeshua's own spiritual resurrection. According to Chilton, Yeshua's journey toward Jewish mysticism began in his early youth when he visited the temple with his mother soon after Joseph's death. He decided that he couldn't return to his home in Nazareth, and he disappeared into the crowd, hoping to remain in the shadow of the temple. Yeshua temporarily lived as a street child in Jerusalem, begging for alms from merchants. At the height of winter, hunger and cold drove him to despair. Rather than return to Nazareth in disgrace, he determined to seek out a renowned rabbi named Yochanan, John the Baptist, and become John's Talmid, his student, his disciple. John's teachings had an esoteric side. John trained his young disciple in the practice of Merkava mysticism, which involved meditation on the divine chariot. As Yeshua combined this meditation with repeated immersions for purification, he came to have an increasingly vivid vision of the heavens splitting open and God's Spirit descending on him in the form of a dove. He began to hear a divine voice affirming his divine sonship. Yeshua did not interpret his divine sonship in the metaphysical terms of the creeds of the Christian church. Instead, Jesus saw himself as belonging to a long line of visionaries who meditated on the chariot and were endowed with the Spirit. When Yeshua eventually returned to his home in Nazareth, many who encountered him, including his own family members, feared that he was insane due to his obsession with meditative practice. This suspicion of insanity brought an end to the initially warm welcome that he had enjoyed in Nazareth. Yeshua confronted the elders in Nazareth and claimed to be God's anointed, his Mashiach, the bearer of the Spirit of Abba, the Father. This was not a messianic claim necessarily, but a claim that he was endowed with a prophetic spirit, so that God spoke to him and through his meditation on the chariot. Yeshua left the Galilee and traveled to Jerusalem, spurred on by his brother's challenge to take his show to Jerusalem or close it permanently. Derived from John chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. This challenge marked a transition in Yeshua's life, after which he sought to act as a chassid, a faith healer. Yeshua's first act as a chassid was the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, in which Yeshua was able to channel the energy of God by drawing the crippled man into his own meditation on the divine throne. After the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, Yeshua's fame spread. Throngs of people seeking healing or exorcism drove him into wilderness solitude. In this solitude, he began using the vision of one like a person from the book of Daniel in his meditations. By 29 of the Common Era, Yeshua's visionary experiences were moving him in an unexpected direction. His intimacy with the one like a person from Daniel, quoting from Daniel, grew to the point that it bordered on full identification. Yeshua's demand that his disciples have the same kind of faith in him that they had in his Abba, his Father, is an expression of his identification with the Son of Man, quote unquote, from Daniel's prophecy. Misunderstanding about the angelic center of Yeshua's spirituality would eventually lead to the doctrine we now know as the Trinity. On several occasions, Yeshua appeared to resurrect the dead. Actually, he was very adept at recognizing the last vestiges of life in the nearly deceased. And it was those people that he brought back. Yeshua's disciples carefully observed his actions and learned his Kabbalah so that they would later perform similar acts. The transfiguration in which Yeshua mystically appeared on a mountain with Moses and Elijah was a product of communal meditation by which Yeshua drew his talmidim, his disciples, into his own visions so that they had a vivid experience of what he saw and heard in his meditation. The one like a person from Daniel would go on to be Yeshua's companion through the tortures that preceded his crucifixion and during the crucifixion itself. This angelic personage led him in his progression from illegitimate child of Mary, as he was accused of being, to pupil of the baptizer, John, to rabbi, to messianic exorcist, to Hasid, to prophet, and finally to angel. Yeshua's alleged post-resurrection appearances were visionary experiences, argues Chilton, of the disciples. who continued to practice Yeshua's Kabbalah even after his death. Well, as theories go, it's fascinating. But that doesn't necessarily make it right. In fact, a lot of this theory involves a good deal of reading between the lines. We've already seen that divine healers were not uncommon in ancient Israel. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were all Merkavah mystics. When it comes to Yeshua, most of his mystical sayings are found in John's Gospel, which, according to most scholars, was influenced more by Greek Gnosticism than by Jewish mysticism. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the overall tone of Yeshua's words is very much down to earth, similar to the teaching of the rabbinic sages, the Pharisees. Aside from the miracles attributed to him, there's nothing particularly mystical about anything Yeshua actually taught. What can we deduce from all this, Watson? As usual, we're left with controversy and debate. Was Jesus an ancient Kabbalist of sorts, or a down-to-earth teacher of what later became Rabbinic Judaism? Brittle answers are easy to come by. It's asking the right questions that raises the bar. Let's take up the challenge and dig a little deeper.